Guys, welcome. Let's kick off. My name's Kevin Rooney, and I've been around the Academy of Ideas since it was formed, and the Battle of Ideas since we started having the Battle of Ideas conferences and festivals. And I'm also a teacher, and the hat that I'm wearing today is I'm editor of a fairly new website called irishborderpoll.com, which campaigns here in Britain to raise awareness of the question of a border poll in Ireland and Irish reunification. So you people who are really good with technology, unlike me, as you're listening to the speakers, if you want to be flicking about with your hands and Googling irishborderpoll.com and have a look at the website, feel free. And if it turns you on, feel free to subscribe and find out more about us. And I should say, first of all, before I forget the actual title, from Indyref2 to a border poll, are we afraid of democracy? And the bottom line is, just to not complicate it, is, are the Scottish people entitled to as many referendums on independence for Scotland as they want if they elect enough members in the Holyrood Parliament that support independence? And are people in the north of Ireland entitled to clarification from the British government as to what criteria would actually trigger a border poll ? Because at the moment that's absolutely not clear, and people in Ireland who support unity think the British government are deliberately obfuscating and not making it clear. The other side disagree. So that's effectively where the debate's going. Ben would have spoke first if he arrived, but he's not here. So we're going to speak in this order. Lord Moylan, Daniel on my left, will speak first, and Daniel's pretty much pro-union. And then we've got Ewan on my right, and Ewan is from Dundee, and Ewan writes a regular column for the Dundee newspaper, and he co-founded an organisation called Sovereignty, which campaigns for Scottish independence. And last but not least, on my right, we've got Dolene Cummins, and Dolene's an associate of the Academy of Ideas, has been around from many, many, many years since the Battle of Ideas was created. And he's just written, Ben, how you doing? Come up, come on. Ben, I think the person who's the happiest to see you on this platform is Lord Moylan on the left. Because he nearly had a heart attack when I told him to go first. So now you're going first.
Yep.
So you're that's your speech. I picked it off for you. So
I did write it.
You speak what I write. So I'll Dolan, God love him. He asked me, he said, Kevin, I've just written a novel. Would you mind mentioning my novel? It's called The Pictish Princess and Other Stories from Before There Was a Scotland, a novel by Dolene Cummins. It's the second best book in Britain and Ireland. The best book is this. This man, Ben Collins, wrote this on the 5th of October, and it's sold out online completely already. Time to prepare for Irish unity. I think we're going to go straight into it. Ben, have you caught your breath?
Yes.
Thank you for coming the whole way across the Irish Sea and flying over here from Belfast to Belfast. Yes. You're very welcome in London, the centre of the empire, or the belly of the imperial beast, as United Irelanders call it. So, when you're ready.
Yes. Thanks very much for having me. I do apologise for being late. It was about 3 different types of train and taxi that was delayed. But anyway, it's great to be here. I'm really keen to have a discussion. I've heard lots of good things about this festival. I think talking is a really good thing. And, as somebody who grew up during the Troubles, I think that's really important. And as I'm going to set out here, I have a very wide range of views, even within my own family, on issues such as Brexit. So I realise that, I respect that, and I think we can all be passionate. I'm up for a bit of banter. I'm from Belfast, and I think it's a Belfast thing that we like to give people a bit of banter, but it doesn't. I think that can happen in a respectful manner. So, just to say, I'm pleased to be here. Thanks to Kevin and everyone at the Battle of Ideas for the invitation, and I'm really looking forward to having this discussion with everyone else here. I was raised with a strongly pro-British and pro-unionist background in East Belfast as a Presbyterian. During the Troubles, I was determined I was not going to be forced into United Ireland by violence or the threat of violence. I was pleased to see the Good Friday Agreement being passed. I was a student in Dundee at the time, which will go down well with Youth Union, yep. So I didn't participate, I didn't vote because I was a student in Dundee, but I watched it from across the Irish Sea and was pleased to see it happening. I joined the Conservative Party in 2001 when I moved back to Scotland, having done a couple of master's courses in Belfast, as I wanted to get involved with bread and butter politics. I always felt British and Irish, but living in Britain changed that. First in Dundee, then Edinburgh. I've also lived and worked in London and Cardiff, and I now live back in my home city of Belfast, work out of an office in Dublin and for clients across Ireland and Europe. I've always been socially liberal and in favour of pro-enterprise, and I've been pro-European. I believe in democracy. For me, sovereignty isn't a flag on a pole, it's food on the table and a roof over your head. Now that the troubles are over, thanks to the Good Friday Agreement, I've been able to look at my identity in new ways and also to consider what is best for my family and wider society. My sense of Irishness has increased and my sense of Britishness has dissipated. Irish unity was a long-term aspiration of mine, but it has become an urgent necessity for me after Brexit. Irish unity is the escape hatch from the dysfunction of Westminster. I want to see a new Ireland which is pluralist, outward-looking and firmly embedded in the European Union. A majority of people in Northern Ireland voted to remain part of the EU. Support for the EU in the Irish Republic sits at around 90%. The Good Friday Agreement states that it's for the people of Ireland alone to decide our future. That is what self-determination is all about. If the UK is truly a voluntary union of equals, we should be able to exercise that right and let the people decide. Next year, the UK will increase corporation tax to 25%. That will mean businesses that want to invest in Ireland will have to choose between Belfast, with a corporation tax of 25%, or a tax rate of 12.5% in Dublin. That will not help to grow the economy and bring hope or prosperity to all citizens who live in Northern Ireland. Ireland's place in the European single market should not be questioned, or indeed its membership of the European Union. I know there are Brexiteers who may wish for the collapse of the EU. One, I do not think that is going to happen. Two, it is not for people in Britain to decide what happens across the continent or in Ireland. You can have your Brexit. Let us have our European future. I have family members and close personal friends who voted for Brexit. While I did not want any part of the UK to leave the EU, I realise that is a democratic choice of England and perhaps still Wales, although that is unclear. Northern Ireland has been a complicating factor for Brexit from day one after the vote. Irish unity is the rational choice if you want to enable a clean Brexit. Northern Ireland, with less than 2 million citizens out of a UK of around 67 million currently, is not a priority for Britain. I would not expect it to be. Democracy does not have a freeze point after which citizens' views and opinions no longer matter. Things are changing across Ireland. In Northern Ireland, for the first time ever, a nationalist party is the largest in the Northern Ireland Assembly. Sinn Féin have the democratic right to appoint a First Minister, but this is being opposed by the DUP, a unionist party who are no longer the largest party in Northern Ireland. The recent census results showed that Catholics now make up a larger part of the population than Protestants. This is seismic in the sense that Ireland was partitioned by the British government specifically to give Northern Ireland a permanent Protestant and Unionist majority. It now has neither. There are now more nationalist MPs than Unionist ones. Opinion polls show increasing support both for Irish unity and for there to be a referendum on removing the border, which was put in Ireland by a British government. We need to prepare now to avoid the chaos of Brexit. I believe that there will be and that there should be a border poll in the next decade. Peter Kyle, the Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, has said that in government he will set out the criteria for a border poll. This is to be welcomed. I'd like to see the current UK Conservative government do the same. Just as many of us support Ukraine's fight for self-determination in the face of Russian aggression, so we should support Northern Ireland's right to choose its own future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I didn't quite know what case I was going to answer, and it's obvious that my remarks after your comments are going to focus probably more on Ireland than on Scotland, because I haven't heard the Scottish case made. But I wanted to make, first of all, a point about this idea that democracy is being denied. Democracy can only exist within a framework of laws, and the unit we have for creating that framework of laws is the nation, the country we live in. And that is the country as it's currently constituted. And it includes Northern Ireland, it includes Scotland and Wales, as well as England. And clearly, while democracy within that is possible, there has to be a sensible recognition of the fact that it can only operate at a certain level. You can't have streets opting into the European Union. You couldn't have London, even though London voted to remain, opting to stay in the European Union while the rest of England left. So localism will only take you so far in regard to that. The second thing is that democracy, well, I'll come back to that point when I get to Scotland in a moment. Let me come to Northern Ireland. And let me say, first of all, that I am a great defender of the Good Friday Agreement. In fact, often I think I'm the only person left who's still defending the Good Friday Agreement, because everybody else is tearing it down and it's practically ceased to exist. But the one part in it that has not yet been scrapped, I mean, Strand 1, Strand 2, and Strand 3 are all non-operative. But the one part that hasn't been scrapped is what Ben referred to, which is the requirement for a border poll in certain circumstances. And I absolutely respect the right of the people of Northern Ireland to have that referendum in the right circumstances. And the circumstances are specified to some extent, not with sufficient clarity to suit Kevin, in the Good Friday Agreement, where it is a decision for the Secretary of State whether to agree to a border poll based on whether he actually thinks it would make any difference, effectively. In other words, whether there is a majority in favour of unification with the Irish Republic. I will just say that to make it all happen, there is also a requirement, and this is mentioned in the Good Friday Agreement, for a further referendum in the Irish Republic to ratify it. But we'll leave that to one side for a moment. So I'm absolutely in favour of that border poll taking place. If that border poll were to take place, I would campaign for, or at least I would support a campaign for the answer to be that Northern Ireland would stay in the Union. But I perfectly respect the views of the majority of the people of Northern Ireland if they decided to go somewhere else. What is happening at the moment, though, is that there are no calls for a border poll in Northern Ireland for a very good reason. Even Sinn Féin isn't calling for a border poll. And that is because all the evidence indicates that the result of such a poll would be that the unionist side, the supporters of the union, you have to be careful in Northern Ireland when you say unionist because it has a narrower and a broader meaning. The supporters of the union would win that poll. And I think Ben's comments are very pertinent here because he illustrates not only the great tradition of Protestant agitation for Irish Home Rule and Irish independence going back a couple of hundreds of years, but he also illustrates the fact that in Northern Ireland, the whole notion of identity based on religion is collapsing. In fact, if you go to the Republic, and I do go to the Republic because I have an Irish background myself, and I even have, or at least my sister has, a house we've inherited from an uncle in Ireland, which we go to. So I do know Ireland reasonably well, or one part of it, out in the west. If you go there, you'd find that Ireland itself no longer has a Catholic identity. And you can see that in the results of referendums on abortion and gay marriage and things like that. So the whole notion that people vote according to identity is a religious identity or religious affiliation is really going out of fashion. We also ignore the fact that an awful lot of the people in Northern Ireland, well, they're getting younger and younger, if you see what I mean. There are a lot of young people who have grown up since the Troubles who have a different perspective. And they don't always slot into the sort of grooves that we expect them to very easily. And there is a growing number of people in Northern Ireland who do not come from an Irish background of either sort. I mean, sort of up from 1% to 5% over the last 20 years, I think, roughly. So they'd have a vote as well, presumably, and they don't fit into those categories. Somebody said to me once that any border poll on Irish unity would be fought on TikTok, and the principal issue would be the NHS. And I don't think that the main parties in Northern Ireland have quite grasped this yet, though perhaps Sinn Féin is more likely to have done so than the DUP. So Northern Ireland, absolutely fine. Have a border poll. See what the result is. And I would support that. But I don't think there's any notion that there's a slam dunk that Irish unity will be supported in Northern Ireland in the foreseeable future. I just don't see it happening. The second thing is Scotland. Scotland's in a different position because, of course, it doesn't have the legal guarantee that exists under the Good Friday Agreement. But there is a tacit understanding that if Scotland voted for independence, then Scotland would achieve independence. So far, it hasn't done so. The question, therefore, comes down to how frequently should they be able to vote for independence. But this is like a marriage in which there is there is more than one party in this marriage. And the effect of ever frequent, the never-endum, we keep having referendums until we win, but then we never have any more. The effect of the never-endum approach is destabilising both to the Union itself, it has an effect on England, Wales and Northern Ireland, but also, if I may say so, to the many people in Scotland who do not support, and in 2014 that was a majority, do not support independence, but whose lives are constantly harassed by this type of never-endum campaign. So some notion of a minimum interval between referendums seems to me to be perfectly consistent with democracy, but at the same time respectful of those who don't necessarily want to leave the United Kingdom. And I think that's my minute gone.
Daniel, just add half a sentence to your speech. What would be your time slot for that period?
Well, people have talked about once every 25 years, and that seems quite reasonable. I mean, the Brexit vote was once every 40-odd years.
Dead on. 25 years. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Dan. Give him a round of applause.
I bring greetings to you all from the promised land of Scotland. As you can probably tell from my accent, I also unfortunately come from one of the most authoritarian parts of the country. Yeah, we'll talk about that perhaps during the discussion. But what I would like to say is, from the outset, is that the Union is on a shugly peg, as we say in Scotland, which is to say, I think its time is limited. I agree with a lot of what's been said today, but two things I'll say. First of all, this week is a very historic week for Scottish democracy. A couple of days ago, I had the opportunity to sit in on the discussions only two streets away from here, where there was discussion whether or not it is within the competence of the Scottish Parliament to hold another referendum on Scottish independence, which, of course, I support. I also support, I should say, being outside of the European Union. So I voted yes in 2014, and I voted to leave in 2016. But the interesting thing is that today is also a very historic day, because exactly 10 years ago, there were 4 people sitting in a room. Those 4 people signed the Edinburgh Agreement. So on the 15th of October 2012, the then UK Prime Minister David Cameron and the then First Minister of Scotland Alex Salmond signed this agreement that enabled Scotland to have a referendum on independence, and 2 years later we did. Now, bear with me just for a moment through the slightly boring part, which is that the Edinburgh Agreement of 2012 enacted Section 30 of the Scotland Act in 1998, and I quote, it says here, Her Majesty may, by order in council, make any modifications to Schedule 4 or 5. You're probably saying, what is Schedule 4 and 5? Well, Schedule 5 includes reserved matters, which also includes the holding of a referendum. Now, an amendment was made in the Scotland Act of 2016, which states that where there is, again I quote, a 2/3 majority in Holyrood on any protected subject matter, including referenda, it must be escalated to the Supreme Court for decision, which is why the discussions have been happening this week. Essentially, the question boils down to this: who decides whether Scotland can or cannot have a referendum? I would even go a stage further and to say that the question is, who owns democracy? We've heard the title of democracy today used. What is democracy? Demokratia. Demos is the common people. Kratia is rule. In other words, the common people rule. You and I rule. And those of us who are in Scotland rule over Scottish matters. So the answer, unfortunately, according to law, appears to be that Westminster controls the situation. However, Nicola Sturgeon did say in discussion with Laura Kuenssberg on Sunday that she questioned the democratic legitimacy of such an arrangement. Now, even if there is currently no legislative lever for holding a referendum in Scotland, with 8 consecutive victories at all tiers of governance in Scotland in almost 8 years of her leadership, it is really hard to argue against the democratic mandate that she has. That's the bottom line. I don't like it, but that's the case. So, however, Liz Truss used her first conference speech, and it may well be her last, to Conservative members last week to redraw her position on Scottish independence, and she said she was going to face down the separatists who threatened to pull apart our precious union. Interestingly, in August, Conservative Lord Frost stated his view that 3/4 of MSPs should support independence before a new referendum is allowed. So, in my final minute or two, if Kevin's nice to me, I want to take you back to September 2019. September the 19th, 2014. It was a typically dreich and autumnal Scottish day. Now, I was fueled up on single malt, as we Scots tend to do, and I was in a room full of fellow independent supporters. I woke around noon that day, and I was disappointed, but I was also submissive to the will of my fellow compatriots who, you know, despite having engaged in many conversations, participated in debates, knocked on many doors, I accepted I did not make the argument strongly enough to compel enough people over the line. Bottom line, I lost. And I accepted at that point that for at least a period of time, and at the time I was of the view 10 years, that we should not have another referendum on independence. We should just get on with doing what domestic politics does. However, we are at that 10-year juncture now, today, actually, where that agreement was had. And redrawing democratic boundary lines on independence, as Lord Frost has proposed, is not a new tactic. Yeah, I'll be less than that. As Lord Frost has proposed, is not a new tactic, but it does differ from the confidence which oozed from David Cameron when he signed that agreement 10 years ago, when support for independence was only at 28%. The difficult issue that we have is that since support for independence has grown and sustained itself, this confidence has turned to concern and curdled into contempt to such an extent where the only group of people to which a right to self-determination does not belong and from whom is withheld is to the Scottish people. So, I would say at this political juncture, I think that our politicians with one voice should declare in the words of our revered 16th century Scottish reformer George Buchanan that all political authority ultimately belongs to the people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Dolan.
Thanks. I mean, I think that the bigger, when the first referendum happened in 2014, some of the international coverage was along the lines of, you know, Scots have failed in their bid for independence, which is clearly a misrepresentation. Scots succeeded in their refusal of independence, but actually more nuanced than that, there was a debate within the Scottish people, and that's the situation which would happen with the second referendum. In a way, the same thing goes to whether there should be a referendum or not. It's not about whether Scottish people are entitled to, or not if they're being held back by a foreign power. You know, there was the referendum just 8 years ago, and so there's a case, as Daniel said, for 25 years. We did talk about it once in a lifetime, and at the time. But for the sake of argument, I think the Scottish voters have consistently voted for a party that is pro-independence, and if that were to continue and accompanied by persistent and popular agitation for a new referendum, I think there would come a point when it would be unavoidable. I don't think we're there yet as it happens, but let's say it is a possibility, and then yes, we'd have to have it. That's very straightforward. So just to come to that then, I think there's an interesting issue. Daniel made this point about unionists in Northern Ireland, and in a way the same is true in Scotland. The SNP, or the independence campaigners, have always been at a bit of an advantage in terms of framing the debate. The SNP are very fond of talking about their opponents as the unionist parties, partly to embarrass Labour by shoehorning them in with the Tories. But the other reason that's effective is that most people in Scotland don't think of themselves as unionist. I appreciate it might have changed a bit since the referendum, but certainly when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, most people would have thought, you know, I don't own a bowler hat or a sash, so how am I unionist? You know, unionist is a kind of slightly fringe identity. Unless you remembered the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party, or maybe a Rangers fan, it wouldn't really occur to you to describe yourself as a unionist, just as it doesn't occur to English people to describe themselves as unionists. And that's not because English people don't like the union or are opposed to the union. It's because they take it for granted. And I think until recently, Scottish people took it for granted as well. Most of them did. I mean, there was always a minority who were pro-independence, and that was fine. But the argument, until very recently, was a little bit marginal. So that brings me to a deeper point about the meaning of the union. And if I can do my boring historical bit, you know, constitutionalists sometimes make the point that Britain is not a nation state, but a political union of nation states, or sometimes people talk about a union state. I think people like Tom Nairn and Neil Asherson talk that way. And I think that's true technically, constitutionally, but I would argue it hasn't really described the political reality for some time, and I'm talking centuries maybe. When the Act of Union took place in 1707, the two parliaments united, that was the political union. But those two parliaments are unrecognisable in terms of what constitutes modern Scotland and modern England. They were not democratic for a start in any meaningful sense. So when we're talking, you know, Kevin wants us to focus on democracy. So I think let's look at the history of that. Democracy emerged in Britain basically on a British scale, focused on the Westminster Parliament. You know, there were obviously struggles up and down Britain, but the focus was in turning the Parliament in Westminster from an unrepresentative and often corrupt platform for the British ruling class into a democratic legislative elected by men and women of all classes and required to reflect their interests and concerns. You know, for economic reasons also, the trade union struggles also increasingly took a British focus rather than taking place within the individual nations. And other institutions evolved that were only ever British, from the BBC to the NHS. So I would argue that over the course of the 20th century in particular, Britain became something much closer to a nation state than to a mere union of otherwise independent nations. And that's emphatically not true of the European Union. Just people often make that comparison. I think it's important to recognize there isn't anything like a European nation. We have a European labour market, but there is no European labour movement. We have a European Parliament, but there is no European public. I think Britain has established itself as a real kind of nation in a way that Europe never did, with the probably obvious exception, or at least question over Northern Ireland, because there was always, to put it mildly, a question mark over whether the entire population of Northern Ireland was part of that nation, and that's the legacy that we've been living with since. But I think Scotland and England have been part of more than a union. And I would say that's for most of the 20th century, there was relatively little concern about the democratic deficit that some identify today, namely the fact that Scottish voters, Welsh voters, and Northern Irish voters are prominent minorities. Because it's true, as long as you think of them as Scottish voters, it's a no-brainer. You know, there's no way that Scottish voters can overrule the English forming such a big majority. Great. That's to forget, though, that for most of modern history, the majority of Scottish voters didn't vote primarily as Scottish voters, but instead as supporters of one of the two or three main UK parties. As such, they often found themselves in the majority electing governments to Westminster. Again, no parallel in the EU, because there's no way to form a majority government at EU level to be part of that. What's changed is that the majority of Scottish voters no longer want to vote for those parties. And the great irony is that this is just one more thing they have in common with English voters, who also no longer want to vote for those parties. The difference, of course, is that English voters don't have the luxury of being able to opt out of what I believe is a false promise that independence offers something substantially different. But I think that's something we can just debate.
Guys, there's a good 40 minutes left, and I'm actually not going to ask them any questions. I'm going to go out to the floor, but what I am going to do is I'll take 60 seconds to throw out and try and clarify for you in my own mind what I picked up. So there's three things I think are particularly interesting to me. You can ignore them, but I want to just throw them out when people are asking the questions. The first one is that Daniel says that, of course, Northern Ireland's entitled to a border poll, and he dismisses the real issue which nationalists see, which is the criteria for a border poll. Ben made the point that pro-United Irelanders have more MPs, for example. If you read the blurb online for this session, the latest opinion poll shows most people want a United Ireland rather than stay part of Britain, although there's different opinion polls. So do we have perfidious Albion? Can the British government be trusted on the criteria for a border poll, question mark? That's the first question. The second question is to do with, Daniel says again, Britain's effectively a unit state of democracy. Decisions get made on that basis democratically. Ewan's effectively saying the Scottish people are a sovereign people. The Scottish people have the right to decide. So I want people to be thinking about that tension. And finally, Dolan makes an interesting point there at the end, or lastly, and he talks about, well, in the 20th century, Britain became effectively a nation state. The Scottish working class, the trade unions, all that, together with English people. It's 21st century now. Do we still have that, or is that fallen away? But you can ask whatever you want. Do I have hands? And there's no such thing as a stupid question.
The Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, recently stood up and roundly poo-pooed the idea of national sovereignty. I can't remember the quote exactly, but the thrust of it was, the very idea that we would want any part of that is patently ridiculous. Now, Micheál Martin is a technocrat to the core, so it wasn't as though he was some sort of renegade. He was outlining exactly what the Irish political class and the Irish elites think, because they're very, very wedded to the European Union. So I suppose this question is mainly for Ben. What will an independent United Ireland look like if Ireland as a nation and its political class are expressly devoted to the European Union?
Great first question. Hold back. We'll take a few at the same time.
There may not be such a thing as a stupid question, but I've really found it difficult to formulate this one. It's for Ewan. Hope that's okay. I'll just ask it and see if it makes sense. On the question of democracy, if you accept that the UK is a coherent nation state, what is democratic about a small minority within that state being able to split it apart? So what about people like me, for example, who understand themselves as a citizen of the United Kingdom, not having a say in what happens to the United Kingdom? So I hope that makes sense.
Great question. Can I ask you a question? Because I forgot to say something out loud at the start. Scotland and the north of Ireland aren't the same. So even though we're having this discussion, there's absolute differences. So you can accuse me of, when I wrote the blurb, of putting the two together, but there's parallels. So Justin, when you asked the question of Ewan, are you talking about the north of Ireland and Scotland equally, just out of interest?
I've partly left Northern Ireland. In fact, Kevin, you might remember this, when you first started being involved with the campaign for the border poll, and you emailed people you knew, I actively got back, well, I did it late, but I got back to you and said I didn't think this was something I could support, not because I'm for or against the border poll, but it seems to me that's for the people of Ireland to work out, and as someone that lives in England, it's got nothing to do with me, and I certainly wasn't going to join a campaign for one way or the other. So I've slightly left it. So for me, it's specifically, I do think the two things are different, and I think the history matters, actually. I think it really does. So I think the state of Northern Ireland is different to the state of Scotland. And so that some of the points Dolan was making about kind of what's changed over those few hundred years, I think does affect the discussion.
God, that's so interesting. But just to be clear, you're saying that this is a question for him, right? But are you effectively acknowledging that the north of Ireland isn't really part of Britain? Is that what you're effectively indirectly saying?
My politics is that I historically would have been on the side that for a united Ireland. So that's where I've come from. But at the moment, particularly with the Good Friday Agreement, that's entirely up to the people of the island of Ireland, whichever particular political part of it they're in.
Fascinating.
So I actually feel I've got less to say on that than I do, for example, about the UK, which I know is contradictory, because obviously if there's a border poll, part of that UK splits too. But the Scotland one seems more immediate to me.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is me thinking out loud, and it's more broadly on the question of democracy. Something Ben said, because of the chaos caused by Brexit, we need a border poll. And I wonder, is the subtext of that, democracy is going to somehow save the day? Does democracy not sometimes deliver you to chaos rather than from chaos? Are the people ready for that outcome? which I think they were in the UK with Brexit broadly. I think a lot of people did see that there would be disruption, but do people get that could happen? So what scares me about democracy is when people see it as an end in itself, that it's going to resolve things. So I suppose I'm broadly agreeing with Lord Moylan on that.
I'm Ian McWhirter. I wrote Disunited Kingdom about the 2014 referendum. I just wanted to put it to you in that the situation has changed enormously. Now, first of all, the white paper on independence did say that it was a once-in-a-generation event, so really there is a question there about credibility. But more importantly, I think the situation has changed so much because of Brexit. So one referendum is affected by another. And I think that the main problem with the SNP's position at the moment is, as you know, they're trying to get a referendum next year. If they fail, or Nicola Sturgeon says she will try to turn the next general election into a de facto referendum, all sorts of democratic questions, legitimacy questions about that. But from my point of view, I think the most serious one is that they haven't addressed the way the situation has changed so dramatically because of Brexit. In 2013, in the white paper, the presumption was that Scotland and England, the rest of the UK, would remain in the European Union and in the single market. So there'd be no hard border. There'd be none of the regulatory issues that have risen in Northern Ireland, for example. Similarly, there would be the presumption, the prospectus for 2014 was that there would be a currency union with England, so there'd be no separate currency. And the SNP is in a terrible fix about this because it's trying to avoid this question. You can't avoid it, that Scotland will have to set up its own central bank and its own independent currency. And, you know, given the present global turmoil, that is a really big ask for next year. And I think, as you possibly know, there's quite a few people in the independence movement who are now questioning whether the referendum route is actually the right way, certainly in the short term. And I wonder what you think about that.
Ian, can I ask you a one-sentence response? Are you effectively saying you, in spirit, you absolutely defend and support the right of Scottish people to have a referendum on independence, but tactically you don't think it's quite ready because the Scottish haven't got their ducks in a row?
I think every Democrat would have. I think every Democrat would have to accept Scotland's right to independence, right of self-determination. If the Scots sincerely and genuinely want to become independent, that has to be permitted. However, there are various degrees of independence, and as I think Dolan implied, actually the Union of 1707 was a union between two nations, and Scotland never ceased to be a nation thereafter. Scotland wasn't occupied by England. You know, Scots have full civil rights, full human rights. There's no question of Scottish culture being extinguished by being part of the Union. In fact, it boosted Scottish culture in all sorts of ways, partly because the English ruling class sort of adopted it for recreational purposes. So, you know, I think, you know, that obviously there has to be a referendum at some time if Scots wish it. I'm just posting a really big warning flag here because the SNP is not facing up to the extent to which Brexit has totally changed the equation in Scotland. And I think it's going to head for real problems when it tries to address that.
Fascinating. And if you're young, I see some very young people in the audience. Don't panic or worry if you know some of the historical references you don't get. Don't worry about it at all. Just get stuck in, and there is no such thing as a stupid question. I really mean that. Right, who would like to pick up? Be brief. Pick up what you want. Daniel or Ewan? Anybody in between? Let the Lord go first. You go second.
You see, this is the no.
If I'm going to go first, I would not really respond to a question because they're not particularly aimed at me, but I would pick up something Ewan said, which is the Scottish people have the right to say, to govern themselves in Scottish matters. And I simply wanted to point out that the Union is not a Scottish matter. The Union neither in law, well, we'll know the legal position when the Supreme Court issues its judgment in a few weeks' time, but on the face of it, it's not a Scottish matter. It's a matter for the United Kingdom as a whole. And in practice, it's not a Scottish matter because there are other people in this marriage. It's like saying divorce is just for me. And that's really the nub of the matter, I think.
This is a stupid question from me, Daniel. Right, give us a one-sentence answer. When it comes, and this is a stupid question, forgive me. Being a good Catholic, I would never get divorced. Can't one person decide on a divorce? even if the other person doesn't want it?
Yeah, but not without.
So what your
not
analogy then
not
is
not without effects on other people. In a democracy, people are entitled to a say when they're being affected as well.
But if
So
I
it's
want
not
to
a perfect.
if I want to divorce
it's not
my
a
wife,
perfect analogy
and she
because
okay.
we don't have democracy in divorce.
Fine.
But the fact is, I think it would be fair to say, Ewan, that if you were to divorce your wife, most of us would feel she was entitled to a say in the matter, and actually the courts will vindicate that say for her and take half your wealth off you.
Brilliant. Great. Ewan, so here, I want you to come back. I want to get a little bit ding-dong going, if I can, between people sometimes. So what do you say? Do Scottish have the right, or is Daniel right?
Well, my wife is not going to divorce me because she enjoys my beard too much in other parts of my body. So, you know, that's never going to happen. But, well, I agree, I suppose. I mean, and it comes to Justine's point, actually, is that, you know, in terms of the question, the UK has always been, and Scotland has always been described within the context of the UK as a union of equals. If there's a situation where one party cannot leave that union, then that ceases to be a union of equals and starts to look a bit like abuse. So I'm of the view that the Scottish people should, and that's the other point about that I should say, just to say, Justine, is that the appetite has been clearly evidenced at the ballot box in Scotland. It hasn't been clearly evidenced at the ballot box at a UK level. There is very little appetite, I think, for a say at a UK level on Scottish independence. So that's the 2 points I would make in response to that. Ian, you're still there, yeah, this silver-haired fox. Big fan of your column, by the way. I read it in the Herald and when I buy it, the Herald on Sunday as well. And I have to say, I've read The Road to the Referendum. Yeah, I read it prior to the referendum, and I found it very persuasive, actually, because I was probably at the point a default no or certainly a fence-sitter. So I found that cajoled me off the line. But in response to your point, I actually think I would probably disagree with you slightly. I think the SNP has actually made a great deal of the issue of Brexit. I mean, their campaign slogan in 2019 was Stop Brexit. You may remember they also referred in their 2016 manifesto to the material difference if Scotland voted to remain in the rest of the UK. And I thought that was quite prophetic, actually, because it turned out that way. So I think they have made something of that. However, I would also say, if you accept, as I do as a Democrat, that the 2014 vote was legitimate, and I accept that I didn't persuade enough over the line to support independence, then I also accept that we voted as part of the UK to leave the European Union. So I accept the democratic legitimacy of both 2014 and 2016. And I actually think that the reasons for Scottish independence, but also remaining outside of the European Union, actually I think there's significant benefit to that as well, which I'm happy to explain if we come to it. But
I'm about to go to you, Ben. I want someone in the audience to come back to me, whether you're Irish, Scottish, English, or from anywhere in the world. And it's to do with this point with Daniel and you. And here's what I really want somebody to come in from the audience on. So, you know, it's going. The Scottish referendum is going through the Supreme Court, they're having a conversation. If more than 50% of the people in Scotland right now today want the referendum, should they just say to the Supreme Court in London, get stuffed, it's popular sovereignty, end of story? He seems to be so mild, the person for Scottish independence, coming back in Daniel. So I'm interested to see what you think about that. Popular sovereignty, end of story. Am I just stupid again? Because I often am. Right, Ben.
Thanks, Kevin. I just wanted to pick up a couple of things Daniel said. First of all, I agree with you that the criteria haven't been met as yet for a border poll. I think that's right. I think they will be met at some point in the next 10 years, but it would help if the UK government, whoever runs it, would actually tell us what the criteria are, and then we could work to that. But I think it's all about planning, and this is not me trying to just use this as a sales pitch, but the reason why my book is called Irish Unity, Time to Prepare is because I want us to prepare in advance. I want us to have a detailed plan. And so to come to the questions about what will Ireland look like as an independent country, Again, it's in the book, but very briefly, I would want it to be, I don't want to continue with the Northern Assembly. I think it might continue for a transitional period, but I don't want Northern Ireland has been semi-detached from the UK for the last 100 years. I don't want us to be semi-detached from the rest of Ireland for the next 100 years. So I want one parliament in Dublin. I want to have equal representation, ideally, across the 4 provinces in the Shannon, and I want to have the same multi-member constituencies you have in the Dáil, or whatever it's called. And I want it to be firmly part of the EU. I think that does not in any way undermine Ireland's sovereignty. It's the choice of the citizens of Ireland to be part of the EU. We leverage that. We have a lot of soft power. The fact Ireland has been able to use that in lots of different ways. Ireland has lots of great soft power. Meet the president once a year, US president. No other world leaders guaranteed an annual meeting. We got a place on the UN Security Council for 2 years, temporary place. Beat out Canada, and everyone loves the Canadians, but that shows what we can do. And just finally, in terms of democracy can deliver you to chaos, I agree with you entirely. But again, that brings me back to my point about why I want us to plan and prepare in advance. I do not want us to have an horrific campaign, and I think setting out the plans and the details can hopefully assuage some of the concerns. I know there's a lot of anger and aggression there from people who voted for Brexit. Within Northern Ireland, within my own family, I have some who are now very upset the way things are going and feel they've been left in the lurch by the UK government. But I think in terms of going ahead, we need to have an evidence-based discussion and put a detailed plan to the people and then decide what the options are.
Ben, about that question from the floor, and I just recognise that's Justin as well from Dublin. I haven't seen him since last year at the last battle. But if an English person said to me, and lots of people from the Academy of Ideas have said this to me, what do you want to go and have your net iron for in the friggin' EU? God's sake, you've no sovereignty then. God's sake, la. And I say, I love you, but mind your business, right? It's my fucking country. It's self-determination. We'll decide. If we make a shit of it, it's our problem, not yours, right? But the person asking the question is Irish.
Yeah.
So you can't say that. So I want you in the next round to think a bit more about what he's saying, because he's saying, Micheál Martin, the Taoiseach, Jesus, we're not going to have any real power and sovereignty. You look at Jeremy Corbyn, we wanted to nationalise the railways a few years ago in Britain. He couldn't do it. What happens if Millie MacDonald is a Taoiseach? She wants to nationalise the railways. She can't do it because the EU don't let you because of free market, whatever,
I don't think, with the greatest respect, and Micheál Martin has devoted many decades to political service, I don't think we need to be too concerned about his views for much longer. I think that the Civil War parties are of their time, and they're not in the same position. He represents a particular establishment view, and I do believe that part of that isn't quite addressing your point, but part of the difficulty that we have if we want to achieve Irish unity is there are lots of establishment people in the South that like things the way they are, and they don't want things to change. And to come back to your point, yes, I think we have to be assured that we do have our say, but it's about being part of a bigger picture. And I think there are lots of benefits to being part of the EU.
Dead on.
Yeah, just quickly wanted to note that, I don't know if it's a paradox, but the Brexit is both the reason for Scotland to have another vote and a reason to vote no. You know, it kind of creates legitimacy in the sense that a lot has changed, but as Ian's pointed out, there's a lot of complications that make it a much harder proposition to have a successful go for it. But the thing is, Brexit was part of the original debate. You know, in 2014, Scottish voters were warned that their English counterparts couldn't be trusted not to take Britain out of the EU, and they voted for it anyway. They voted against independence anyway. And of course, it's true that the majority in the EU referendum, the majority in Scotland voted Remain, but it's sometimes presented as if it was overwhelming. And, you know, actually more than 1 million Scottish voters voted for Brexit. So it's not an insignificant minority for Ewan to work with when he's doing his double out campaign. But I do think the other thing worth noting on that is that the Brexit referendum was held by a government that didn't want it to go through. They wanted the people to vote against it. Therefore, they didn't prepare. So this point about preparing for Irish unity, I think, is a very good idea, whether it happens or not, because you can see a lot of the problems that have come up around Brexit are not intrinsic, but there are many intrinsic ones. But the fact that the government didn't prepare for it, just wasn't expecting it, was a huge part of that. And so, I mean, I think the democratic debate has to be more than just a yes/no answer. It has to be deeper.
Okay, I have 3 questions for you. Because the session is on democracy, And the panelists have been talking about referendums. When is it feasible to have a referendum and all the rest of it? So my first question to the panel, what do you think about the idea of a primary referendum whereby you ask citizens, do you want another referendum, rather than sort of, based on sort of legal decisions and existing constitutional outcomes? Would you support that? So I'd be interested in what you would say to that. Secondly, and this is a question more directly related to you, do you ever think Scottish civic nationalism is a little bit overplayed, given the very low voter turnout in Scottish Parliament, barely above 50%, for an agreement for Scottish Parliament? Because yes, the SNP do win half the votes, but the voting turnout is actually sort of very low, and it's Westminster for a lot of Scottish voters that actually sort of matters, and so they still identify Britain as a nation state. And the final question is a bit more of a contentious question. Do you think Welsh constituency, Northern Ireland, and in particular Scotland, do you think there's a danger that they are used as a bulwark, as a check and a balance on the English working classes' aspiration for Brexit, right? Because you have a lot of Remainers in England cheering on Scottish independence, because they know if you've got the EU on the border of England, it puts pressure on England in terms of the EU.
I suppose there's a narrative that Ireland, there's some form of kind of democratic deficit in Ireland's membership of the European Union, which I would kind of outrightly reject. I think Ireland, as a small country in the European Union, compared to our neighbours on the continent, have leveraged our position extremely well since our accession. And I would also add that prior to Ireland joining the European Union, we had a GDP per capita that was considerably less than those in the UK. We're also a very kind of agricultural-based economy, and one that had no kind of form of foreign direct investment. And since then, we've actually leapfrogged Northern Ireland. I mean, Belfast was once a much more developed city than Dublin. That's now changed as a direct result of Ireland's membership of the European Union. You can go up and down the country and you see projects that have been funded by European structural funds and so on. So I think we've leveraged our position quite well. And to add another commentary around, Ireland's political class kind of being wedded to this notion of a partitioned state, I mean, I would certainly reject that. And I mean, recent opinion polls, we see Sinn Féin, of course, a nationalist party, perhaps have tempered their views in recent years, but they are, at the core, a nationalist party that are doing extremely well in opinion polls. And I think the winds of change in Ireland, swept through with marriage equality, repealing the 8th Amendment. I think young people are certainly in the mood for change. And I mean, equally, while the Taoiseach has been somewhat reserved about his comments, I think that is not fair to say for other members of the government parties who have engaged. For example, the Taoiseach spoke at the Ireland's Future event last week, and so on. So I think the idea that the political class in Ireland are somehow kind of wedded to this kind of to the status quo, I would reject that. And I mean, to add, I suppose, a comment. Sorry, and to add one comment to Lord Moylan's point about, I suppose, one part of the UK can't opt in, opt out. I think something that hasn't mentioned today is the Northern Ireland Protocol. I think the Northern Ireland Protocol kind of allows, actually, Northern Ireland, the only part of the UK, to have one foot in the single market and one foot in the one foot in the European single market and one foot in the UK market as well. So I think that's actually happening with the Northern Ireland Protocol. So I think there is actually provisions for Northern Ireland to kind of diverge from the rest of the UK on that.
I suppose I think it's really interesting that sort of I've supported Irish freedom my whole life, and marched and threw things at people in order to try and get it. There you go. So I suppose it's really interesting that we're now at this juncture where we're saying that this could happen. So for those of us who've supported all our lives, it's very interesting. But what's interesting to me about some of the conversation today as well is that it's like we're now going to have another conversation that's really about divide and rule again. That it's all about, there's a danger that it becomes about identity politics. And I agree that we need to plan. I certainly have no faith in the Taoiseach or the ruling class in Ireland to want to deliver an Ireland that I would be happy with. And all the other ruling elites. And they've jumped on the bandwagon very late in the day. And I think for Ben and Kevin and people like us who want to see a United Ireland, better type of Ireland maybe, we're going to have to fight on the ground up to get the type of plan that we want, because they will definitely, no more than the British government, as Dolan said, will leave it to the last minute. And there is already very divisive conversations taking place about what the United Ireland might look like. And there will be place in it, I think, for everybody. But I also think this thing about, well, should you really want United Ireland when you're still in the EU is rubbish. Let's get our United Ireland and let's decide then on what kind of Ireland we want. Whether or not that is going to undermine the UK, I guess it does. And I think, you know, from my point of view, that's an interesting debate. So the Scottish piece of it is, I think, slightly different, but it is also the same, because it is about splitting up the union. And what will the new union look like for British people? It'll be interesting to see.
I just want to come back to this whole question of the EU. I know Ireland has done very, very well out of the EU. It's played its cards very well. It's been able to exploit that relationship very well. But it still doesn't, as far as I'm concerned, address the question of sovereignty, of your ability to actually establish an independent entity. And similarly, of course, for Scotland, because both declare now that their intention is to put their independence under the ambit of the EU. Now, I know you say you don't accept that, but you are exceptional amongst the nationalists in Scotland. But I similarly think in Ireland, you're just not grasping that. You're subordinating your independent countries to a completely undemocratic organization.
Yes, thanks, Kevin. It's a great discussion. I think the one point I'd like to make is, as an official who was sort of marginally involved in the Good Friday negotiation process back in the 90s, I mean, what worries me is the impact of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and it's, in a way, contaminating. I mean, I really don't buy the idea that we're a bit like Russia versus your Ukraine. You know, I think there's an absolute respect for the right of the people of Ireland to determine their own future enshrined in that agreement. What concerns me is the fact that, you know, the EU, having chosen to use this as a lever to fight the wider Brexit battle, and I think some pretty unhelpful interventions from the US has kind of muddied the waters slightly. And it's not clear to me that actually the Northern Ireland Protocol is delivering a better economic impact for the North. But it's also putting the Northern Ireland Agreement, or the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, in danger, because it's leaving the unionist community feeling utterly trampled on and dealt with like second-class citizens. And I just don't think that's fair.
Yeah, so I guess my point was pick on something you said, Kevin, about whether or not a referendum happens with the Supreme Court or the British government's permission. I would ask, well, what other choice have we got? Do we really believe that if the Supreme Court says no and that Liz Truss faces down Nicola Sturgeon, that this is going to go away? I think ultimately that, you know, the way the conversation's going in Scotland, that, you know, there's going to be another referendum soon, with or without permission. So ultimately, I would say, you know, even though I think I would vote to remain, I would say that, yeah, it's you know, it's going to happen whether or not we get permission from the British government or not.
Thanks a lot. I'm Welsh, and I was sitting here as a kind of impartial bystander, really. Right? Well, exactly. Thank you very much. Yeah. So I was trying to be impartial, but I'm not, because the fact is we end up with a kind of watered down version of whatever Scotland gets, whether we thought we wanted it or not. I mean, we'll never be independent, but we will end up as not fully integrated into the United Kingdom either. Okay, so my problem is the unintended consequences of this for the UK as a whole. My question is a stupid one, okay, because I know the answer already. I think Lord Moylan said you can't have devolution down to the level of individual streets, which is obviously true, but there's a big difference in scale between a street and a country. And there are many other possibilities. If you think that within the European Union, there are countries which are notionally independent, like Malta with a population the size of Leicestershire, right? Now, admittedly, you know, it's propped up by European money and money laundering, but apart from that, it's an independent country, okay? my question is, and I apologise for the stupid question, what would be your response, in a newly independent Scotland if Orkney and Shetland voted to leave or to reintegrate with Norway?
I was going to say that I think it's kind of misleading to present the debate as purely domestic, because Westminster isn't just like a big bad evil that's stopping Scotland and Northern Ireland from seceding. There are other international factors playing upon them that stops them from doing that. If they were to let them to leave, that sets an international precedent for places like Catalonia or even like Donetsk and Luhansk to have their right to self-determination. So, and especially now more than ever when the Tories are scrambling for a trade deal, how can the UK set that precedent and jeopardize their international relations?
My question's mainly for the Scottish side, because I can guess the Northern Irish response for this, but if Scotland were to be independent, would you see a royal head of state like the other Commonwealth nations?
So this is just summing up, you get about 60 seconds.
No, mate, no, come on, there's like 8 questions that have been directed at me.
I am in such trouble if you go by half past.
Right, okay, let me try and get through these in 60 seconds then. Question number 1, the phrase neverendum has been used. In fact, 3 of them came from you, sir, so I'm coming back to you. Neverendum. There's no such thing as a neverendum. We had one referendum, and it was 8 years ago, so this neverendum garbage, give me a break. So, question number 2, you asked about turnout. The turnout in the referendum in Scottish independence was actually 85%, and at the following general election a year later, Scotland turned out in significant number, 71%, which was higher than any other part of the UK. So I'm not sure I'm with you 100% on the turnout issue, although it has declined significantly since then. We're around 30% for local elections, which is really bad. Point number 3, you were talking about representation. I think we need to have a conversation about PR. I would actually, and this conflicts with my sort of soft libertarianism. Oh, for crying out loud. Right. We need to have a conversation about whether or not to make it, to have, what's the term, voting, where you have a none of the above option. But I would support PR. Is it going to be a bulwark? Possibly, if we were to leave the Union but join the European Union. Although I am opposed to this hokey-cokey constitutionalism, having one foot in, one foot out. Good grief. Right, okay. Popular sovereignty, bottom line, I think that we need to, it's about popular sovereignty. What do the people want? Let them have their vote, let them have their say.
I can tell you now what I really think. What I really think is that Nicola Sturgeon would be absolutely terrified if the Supreme Court found that she could have a referendum, because I think she knows that if she had a referendum in the course of the next year, she'd lose it. That would be the end of her. I don't think that Scotland is ready to vote for independence, and I do think the circumstances about Brexit will bring that home very clearly. On Northern Ireland is absolutely entitled to a border poll in certain circumstances. Those circumstances simply don't pertain at the moment, and Ben agrees with that. And he thinks maybe in 10 years, I would say longer, and that's a judgment, and we'll find out who's right about that. But I would say very much longer, because I think things have changed a great deal. So the argument is there should be, the British government should spell out in more detailed criteria, to which it then could be held in some sort of way. But the criteria are meant to be very dependent on circumstances at the time. And trying to remove that flexibility, I think, would be a mistake both for the British government and for the people of Northern Ireland.
MPs say yes, we keep the monarchy, which is another reason for saying what's the point. I don't think Northern Ireland's a special case. I think Scotland and Wales are not ready-made nations, ready to go their separate ways. I think independence would mean forging a new nation, almost a new nation from start. And this famous line associated with Alice de Grey, work as if you live in the early days of a better nation, which is nice. It's really inspiring, but I think it's another way of saying I wouldn't start from here. And I think the difficulty of democracy is reckoning with the nation you already have. And I think that's a challenge for whether you want independence or you want to stay in Britain. Britain needs to have that kind of reinvention as well. So I think if you could do it on a Scottish scale, why not do it on a British scale?
Thank you, Dolan.
Yes, in terms of the question about Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland being used to stop English Brexit, I think there is an element of that. I personally am sympathetic to Welsh and Scottish nationalism, but I purposely am not going to take an active role in it. Not that anyone cares whether I do or not, but I think it's not for me to say. And I think if England has voted for Brexit, you should be able to enjoy the full benefits or otherwise of it. Jude is right. 10 political parties were represented in the Ireland's Future event. The main political class are coming on board, but it has to be about identifying, it has to be about building a better future for housing, health, education. That's why we need to plan. And to come back to your point, Nick, about Ukraine and Russia, I was not in any circumstance suggesting that the UK is like Russia. I worked in the Northern Ireland office as a press officer. I think the UK government did a great job in the peace process. More recently, not so great. I think it's been destabilising, but I think Irish unity will allow us to have much better relationships with Britain, whatever shape Britain is, and that I really want that because it's important to me. I have family members that live here in London. I have a brother born in London, born in England, and I want us to have that. For me, Irish unity, it's not separatism, it's unifying our island, but we want to have close relations with Britain.
A round of applause.